Hey everybody. So we like to play video games. People, I mean. 50 years of a continued gaming market have proven that we find something just fascinating about the video game concept we've developed in the last few generations. Why? Well, everyone who's played a game will probably have their own answer. Video games are a brilliantly complex art form like any other, and depending on the game, players could be drawn in by an enthralling story, beautiful art and music, engaging gameplay, or any number of other features that help them form a personal connection to the game at hand. With that in mind, why are we so captivated by things like this? A peculiar little subsection of today's games are the appropriately named endless runners. If you've come into contact with one, it's almost certainly been burned into your mind by the liquid crystal display of your mobile device of choice. These little arcade-style experiences have a surprisingly long history, filled with more twists and turns than you might initially think. And in its own roundabout way, the genre has produced some of the most recognizable titles of the past few decades. But have you played one recently? If so, you might be more than a little disappointed. There are, of course, always exceptions, genuine gems made by devoted game makers. But on the whole, the mobile app stores of today seem to be dominated by cheap, uninteresting endless runner titles that just seem to pop up everywhere you look. How did this happen? And honestly, why does it matter? As you might be able to guess, that's what I'm gonna tell you today. Let's take a deep dive into the endless decay of the endless runner. Now, I'm not going to go all in on the history of video games. I can't really remember whether I've discussed it on this channel or not, but trust me when I say it's a whole damn story in and of itself. So I'll give you the abridged version. Around the halfway point of the 20th century, a handful of researchers and scientists and other individuals, a lot smarter than me, all around the globe began to work on basic simulation and strategy programs using early mainframe computers. Early projects like this throughout the 60s and 70s usually went one of two ways: simple physics and tactical simulations like Tennis for Two or Space War, and strategy or resource management games like dungeon crawlers and adventure titles. Due to hardware and graphical limitations, the latter category was often less what we'd consider a video game and more reading text on a screen. But I digress. In the 1970s, a small spattering of entrepreneurial companies like Atari and Magnavox realized that there very well could be money to be made through the video game concept, and throughout this decade a number of consoles for both public and home use began production. Unlike the mainframe systems of the past, these were devices built specially for the purpose of playing games, and they were capable of much, much more. While many early home console systems were largely unsuccessful, more advanced projects like the Coleco Telestar brought 3 or even 4 dedicated games into the hands of players with just a single 4-pound controller, complete with wood paneling. This new breed of console focused almost entirely on games that could realistically be played with a couple of lines and a ball, like tennis or hockey, although if you were lucky they'd give you a gun and have you shoot at squares on your screen. But while the home console market busied itself making handball simulators, another market was about to explode, with serious ramifications for the future.
Jerry, video games are the latest craze to sweep the country and most of the world, too. Millions of people are addicted to hours of gazing at electronic images on game screens in arcades and in their own homes. What makes video games so popular? Well, we search for an answer as we begin a special series on Video Fever, games people play.
Arcades had been around since the turn of the century, but for the longest time they were occupied almost entirely by skee-ball machines, pinball cabinets, and novelty electromechanical titles with names like Periscope and Missile. Video games would completely transform the arcade experience. Asteroids, Space Invaders, Breakout, Galaga, hit after hit after hit struck the arcade industry, and by the early 1980s, there were close to 10,000 arcades in North America, an all-time peak for the business. Arcade machines were built for one thing and one thing only: to play video games. But unlike a home console, arcade patrons couldn't exactly take the game home. In fact, they very often couldn't play for more than a few minutes at a time without moving on and giving someone else a turn at the cabinet. With these limitations in mind, a new breed of game was born. Engaging gameplay and linear progression were king, with players only playing as long as their quarters could carry them. There wasn't really time for a characterization or a cohesive narrative. All that mattered was getting to the next level and improving your skill to one day get on the leaderboard. It became known as arcade style, but in those days they were just games. You went down to an arcade and played as long as you could, each successive stage getting harder until you were eventually defeated. This simple but extremely addictive gameplay style was a staggering hit. It was straightforward enough for casual players to pick up with little to no prior experience, but could, with time, become challenging enough to continue to thwart the most experienced of arcade visitors. It was also perfectly suited for the still limited hardware of the time, as developers could focus almost entirely on creating challenging and rewarding gameplay without devoting precious memory to other, less crucial elements. As even more genre-defining titles like Pac-Man, Tempest, and Defender hit the scene, this formula proved just as effective and was indeed refined. Each successive level could feature small changes to keep gameplay fresh. Enemies could be programmed to act in unpredictable ways, encouraging replayability. But all the while, these games stayed true to the arcade-style spirit. Even more cohesive, less abstract games like Donkey Kong, Burger Time, and Pole Position still leaned very heavily on this repeatable gameplay format, and players knew it very well. You play the game, you get better, you level up, and you go back to play again. Of course, there were notable exceptions, like the 1983 Don Bluth classic Dragon's Lair, which used Laserdisc technology to bring stunning visuals and an actual cohesive storyline to the screens of arcade cabinets. But these were few and far between. On the whole, the early 1980s were dominated by the gameplay-heavy, never-ending challenge of the arcade-style video game. But what if we were to take things just a step further? While the golden age of the arcade game was indeed in full swing, the home console market was far from stagnant. Bigger and better consoles continued to be made, many of which attempted to bring the addictive action of arcade-style experiences to the living room TV. And it was around this time that some developers even began to consider designing titles for the rapidly developing personal computer market. If one were to finish their game of Dig Dug and step outside a busy arcade one morning in 1983, they might have been able to take a quick stroll downtown and step inside a convenient department store to take a look at a strange little home computer called the Commodore 64. Since its release, the C64 had been the odd one out among personal computers, at least in the North American market. When placed side by side with the Apple IIe, IBM PC, and even Radio Shack's moderately priced TRS-80, the Commodore's $595 price tag seemed almost too good to be true. The computer was billed, by Commodore Business Machines, as a system for the everyman, the American equivalent to the British ZX Spectrum, and in many ways it really was. Eventually going down as the best-selling single computer system of all time, the Commodore 64 dominated the low to mid-range PC market, largely due to the fact that, despite its modest price, it featured support for high-end graphics and sound, making it extremely appealing to the average customer. Constructed not only for business and scientific endeavors, the Commodore saw heavy use in both creative and recreational fields. Naturally, this included video games. Much of the Commodore's early technical development was actually done in preparation for a next-gen gaming console, and the computer turned out to be a natural frontrunner for the still experimental PC gaming market. The C64 saw both original adventure titles and ports of notable arcade classics in the first few years of its popularity, and it is with this system that we would see more of the groundwork be laid for a certain future genre. BC's Quest for Tires was a Commodore 64 title released by Sierra Online in 1983. Licensed by the popular BC Comics franchise, Quest for Tires was a simple side-scroller in which the player took on the role of a caveman traversing dangerous obstacles to rescue his girlfriend from danger. The game was moderately successful and praised for its, quote, first-rate animation and, quote, excellent graphics, but where it truly made a mark, at least in a historical sense, was with the type of gameplay it chose to pursue. In many ways, Quest for Tires simply took the arcade-style formula and went just a little bit further. It was sort of like the ultimate distillation of what an endless arcade experience was meant to represent. The player did not stop. In fact, their caveman unicycle was stuck in full overdrive at all times, with the player controlling only their vertical and lateral motion within the screen border. Aside from small breaks in between levels akin to those seen in Donkey Kong, gameplay was continuous and unending, the player only truly stopping when they hit an obstacle. Given an arbitrary level of skill, they could theoretically continue for all eternity, or at least until the Commodore ran out of power or memory. These were the beginnings of the Endless Runner. Endless Runners could be considered a subcategory of the already widespread arcade genre. They featured the same approachable but gradually ramping difficulty, the same straightforward but deceivingly deep mechanics, the same heavy emphasis on gameplay over other elements. But a true Endless Runner took these elements and streamlined them, removing all but the most essential components. Endless Runner gameplay was overwhelmingly defensive. That is, there very often was no objective other than to survive as long as possible. Unlike Qbert, where the player can only advance to the next stage by changing the color of each cube, or Galaxian, where the player was required to destroy every enemy on screen, an Endless Runner generally doesn't ask action of the player. It simply sends danger toward the player and tasks them with avoiding or neutralizing it. There's no stopping, no overarching goals, no particularly complex mechanics to deal with while playing. You just run for as long as you can, and seeing just how long you can go really is the fun of it. But it should be noted that Quest for Tires wasn't what many consider a true Endless Runner. And even if it was, games of this type were few and far between in the mid-80s, and they were becoming less common by the day. Times were, in their usual unpredictable way, beginning to change. The decline of arcades couldn't exactly be attributed to any one factor, but a major one was undoubtedly the opposite of what made arcades successful in the first place. The Nintendo Family Computer hit Japanese markets in 1983, rebranded, redesigned, and re-released as the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985 to audiences outside of Japan. The home console revolution was soon afterwards in full swing, with bigger and better consoles being released on a yearly basis. Each built off existing technology, and in the blink of an eye, the arcade was no longer the premier destination for players, nor was the arcade-style game any longer the spearhead of the video gaming industry. With console titles no longer consisting entirely of ball-and-stick games, experiences that were previously only possible in arcades could now be brought into the home. And with this came a fundamental shift in the type of games that entered the public consciousness. With the bite-sized playtime of arcade cabinets no longer the prime target for developers, they now began to focus their efforts on the long play, creating more linear, structured, and even story-driven games with defined beginnings and ends. 1981's Donkey Kong, with its 4 looping stages and gameplay based around achieving a high score, gave way to 1985's Super Mario Bros., with its 8 worlds of unique stages, each with a defined endpoint and specialized power-ups designed to help the player complete each stage successfully. This new wave of games featured endings, and once you finished, you were done. You won. Of course, there was replayability, but the majority of effort was expended on making a playthrough its own story, rather than on infinitely scaling games of skill. So, this in mind, whatever became of arcades? Well, they certainly didn't die out, if that's what you're wondering. Arcades persisted throughout the rest of the 80s, 90s, and beyond, but they weren't the big-ticket item they'd once been. With many of their features now accessible on home consoles, and by this time, some personal computers, arcades now generally serve the purpose of giving players experiences they simply could not achieve at home. Rhythm games with custom musical controllers, one-on-one fighters where 2 participants could play side by side. And as far as the arcade-style genre, it too remained, but it became exactly that, a genre among the ranks of other such categories like shooters, strategy games, and RPGs, rather than the industry-defining sensation it had been in the early 1980s. Arcades and their unique style of gameplay remained popular among those who still wanted to develop their skill and set a new high score, but they would never again reach the heights they had achieved in their golden age. And as for the Endless Runner, that strange little subgenre that had only briefly seen its time in the sun, well, it too would disappear almost entirely by the 1990s. And as far as anyone of the time knew, this disappearance was for good.
You've got mail.
Hey, now it's 2004. The internet exists now. Or, I guess it's existed for a while, but now you finally have it. You just got DSL set up at home, and now you can make an account on Friendster, MySpace, search the web, and if you get really bored, maybe play a game. Throughout the early 2000s, a bold new frontier of independent game development was sweeping the still rapidly expanding internet. With the advent of JavaScript applets and the staggering potential of animation software like Macromedia Flash, web-bound game devs had started to realize that not only was the internet a feasible breeding ground for small game projects, it was almost like it was made for them. Thus, browser games were born. The widespread appeal of the internet and its rapid transmission of information meant that if someone could make a game, they could sure as hell find players. Sites like Addicting Games, Miniclip, Newgrounds, Congregate, and more would spring up in just a matter of years to act as portals and hosts for game makers the world over. Obviously, web game development by nature was technologically limited for a long time. It would be years before browser games could even come close to enjoying the technical capabilities of consoles and PCs. But that didn't at all mean they couldn't still feature enthralling stories, beautiful art, and truly unique gameplay, made all the more special by the unorthodox environment they'd been born from. But it was with this bold new breed of games that the arcade-style game would see a rebirth of sorts. You see, in many ways, browser game aggregator sites acted a lot like the arcades of old. Players would pop in on quiet afternoons and jump from game to game, finding ones they enjoyed and spending hours perfecting their skills, with the goal, of course, being to outperform other players and score high. While many browser games were of a more conventional sort, story-driven or built in a more linear style, this didn't change the fact that arcade games were back in fashion. The web saw the birth of many new types of arcade-style experiences, like launcher games, where the player would repeatedly launch a truck or a turtle or something else over and over again, upgrading in between to try to make it as far as possible. Browser games of this kind, and many more like them, were simple, addictive, easy to pick up, and endlessly replayable. But there were differences, and they were significant. Upgrading notably played a much larger role in browser games than it had ever done in brick-and-mortar arcades. While it was still crucial to improve your skills, there was something genuinely addicting about spending hours grinding for enough money to afford the next upgrade and get even further on your next round. The endlessly scaling and gameplay-heavy spirit of 80s classics had endured, but it wasn't quite the same. However, this new arcade era would prove to be the perfect staging ground for the reignition of something almost entirely forgotten. Similarly to how Quest for Tires had simplified and streamlined the arcade experience over 25 years prior, Adam Saltzman's 2009 browser title Canabalt would almost single-handedly redefine the Endless Runner for a new generation. Canabalt's gameplay was deceivingly simple. The player had control of a single button, allowing the player character to jump as they fled a collapsing city. The game's goal was a familiar one: to run as far as possible, dodging danger all the while, before turning, as the game put it, into a fine mist. To call Canabalt successful would be an understatement. It combined classically addicting Endless Runner fun with a distinct art style and responsive controls, and the fact that it was initially free didn't hurt. While the DNA of the Endless Runner had emerged from many places in the years prior, it was with Canabalt that they finally coalesced into a form that packed one hell of a punch. But Canabalt wasn't the pinnacle of Endless Runner development. Quite the contrary, it was just the beginning.
This is a day I've been looking forward to for 2.5 years.
In June and September of 2007, Apple Computer, whose 1983 Apple IIe PC had been outsold by the Commodore 64 decades prior, announced the release of two groundbreaking devices, the oddly named iPhone and iPod Touch. While it had been featured in devices before this point, these two mobile devices are widely credited with introducing the touchscreen concept to a wider audience than ever before, and from this point onward, touchscreen tech became the industry standard. The development of App Store concepts would then make designing applications for touchscreen devices an industry of its own. And if there's one thing we've learned from the previous few decades of tech development, it's that where consumer electronics go, games are certainly soon to follow. While a few earlier devices had come preloaded with simple games like the Nokia 6110's Snake clone, this new wave of mobile game development was an entirely different beast. Many early trailblazers like PopCap's Bejeweled and Tapulus's Tap Tap Revenge made use of features entirely unique to mobile devices, placing heavy emphasis on the touchscreen, movement of the device, and its orientation, things that had never before been possible with conventional consoles or web games. But mobile game development presented its own challenges. For one, well, mobile screens are tiny. I mean, they've certainly gotten a lot bigger in recent years, but the original iPhone was 2.5 by 4.5 inches in size, and it's understandably more than a little difficult to fit a complex game onto a screen smaller than a postcard. In addition, the main draw of a mobile device was that it was, well, mobile. You generally weren't going to have users sitting down for an hour with their Galaxy S to be immersed in long-form gameplay. So what was needed seemed to be simple, easy to pick up games with short, bite-sized playtimes. Sound familiar? Mobile gaming was where endless runners truly found their niche. Games that survived in the mobile market, generally speaking, needed to be snackable. In other words, a session had to be able to be started and completed in a 3 to 5 minute time span, and these time spans needed to be self-contained but repeatable. A user needed to be able to have just as much fun playing a single 4-minute round on their phone waiting for the bus as they would playing several rounds over an hour while on an airplane. While other legendary mobile games like Rovio's Angry Birds or Zeptolab's Cut the Rope adopted a level progression format, many still embraced the endless runner style. Many mobile runners adopted characteristics of the browser games that preceded them. Numerous examples featured an in-between run upgrade format, where users would spend some type of currency earned during their runs on upgrades that would, alongside their increasing skill with the game, help them run even further next time. And because of the nature of endless runners as a whole, there really was no right way to play them. The only objective, of course, was to set as high of a record as possible, and the longer you played, the better you'd get at making this happen. Mobile endless runners were the everyman's game, something anybody could pick up and play at any time they wanted, and stop playing at any time without worrying about losing progress, since the only progress that mattered was that you'd made in your current run. Not that you'd want to put them down, of course, these things were built to be addictive. Like the arcade cabinets of the past, mobile games were built to be enthralling and to draw players back in time and time again. But unlike arcade games, you didn't need quarters to make it work, since most mobile games of the era were free to play. Jetpack Joyride, Doodle Jump, Temple Run, and so on and so forth, the Endless Runner flourished in this new environment, and numerous mobile gaming titans were born seemingly overnight. But the idea of an endless runner seems almost too simple to work. If all game devs needed was to throw the player into an infinite environment and tell them to survive, why the hell didn't anybody do it sooner? Well, as it would turn out, there was a lot more to the endless runners of the mobile golden age than met the eye. Many of the games I've listed, and some that I haven't, have managed to survive to today. Jetpack Joyride, Subway Surfers, Punch Quest, Flappy Bird, debatably, and so on. These games, as several hours of wasted time while writing this script can attest to, remain engaging and interesting even 10 years later, proving their appeal extends far beyond novelty. So what was it that made them work? Well, they each featured one or more of a few major aspects that elevate them beyond just a simple running simulator. Understandably very important was replayability. Gameplay was always very simple on the surface, the player often having control over only a single aspect of movement, but was often surprisingly deep. Early gameplay could be surmounted by basic instinct and mindless tapping, but as the experience ramped up in difficulty, the player would need to put genuine thought behind their actions. When to jump, how long to jump for, whether or not to pick up a boost or thereabouts. The longer they played, the more important their individual actions became, and the more finely their skills needed to be tuned in order to survive. In the same vein, they'd often feature challenges that wouldn't appear until you reached a certain point in a run, features you didn't even know existed when you picked up the game for the first time that were unlocked as you grew better and better at it. And the process of getting better and better was never really a drag either, since the devs of the best endless runners often put genuine care and work into making everything from the art to the music to the feedback from gameplay feel pleasing and interesting even after a long while. But of course it wasn't just this. Classic endless runners were usually pretty unique. Now, granted, that could very well be because of just how few similar games there were at the time, but it doesn't change the fact that when you picked one up, you immediately knew what it was. Although each controlled almost the same, the way these controls were interpreted made each runner its own special experience that challenged your skills in unique ways. Your skill in Doodle Jump had no bearing on your skill in Crossy Road, and this kept each new game experience fresh and interesting. Visually as well, these games each went their own distinct way. Some were 2D, some were 3D, some boasted hand-drawn graphics while others adopted pixel art, which was quite popular at the time. You could run through these games one at a time and never really get bored. The gameplay itself was also crucial to this. Everything from the controls to the feedback was legendarily responsive. These were games you were meant to feel, in some cases quite literally if they used the phone's vibration features. Playing runners always felt punchy and kinetically satisfying, for lack of better terms. The act of playing them felt rewarding on its own, even without considering the sense of accomplishment you got from achieving high. And the game mechanics weren't unchanging either. Like stated before, game elements were always a hell of a lot deeper than they seemed on the surface. There were often mechanics you wouldn't even know about until a certain point. Temple Run 2, for instance, featured mine segments with varied controls that only appeared later on, after the player had gotten good enough to reach a certain point. And these challenges were numerous and varied enough to keep gameplay interesting even after hours of combined playtime. But I believe the single most important characteristic, and something that had always been key to the success of the Endless Runner, was the feeling of progression players could derive from these games. Incredibly easy to pick up, but remarkably difficult to master. These games learned a crucial lesson from the success of classics like Tempest, in creating experiences that punished you for every stage you advanced, but were just feasible enough for the player to regularly progress and feel a sense of accomplishment for every 100 meters they could run. With very little in the way of concrete checkpoints or mile markers, Endless Runners played instead on the player's own competitive drive to make every new record feel like a victory won. And that's what made these games so fun, so addictive, so hard to put down. It was like you were competing against yourself, running again and again and again to develop new skills that'd help you survive further and enjoy the run for as long as possible. Some games would even go the extra mile by adding useful but fair upgrades that allowed players to obtain a more concrete boost alongside their growing skill. All in all, this created a feedback loop, putting players through the motions of playing again and again to build their ability and save up for useful equipment, which in turn allowed them to run even longer. What made good Endless Runners good was that they pitted the player against themselves, placing them in a constant race to succeed further than ever before, without even needing to give them a concrete reward of any kind. Endless Runners were simple on the surface and honestly quite approachable, but beneath the hood they were streamlined, complex, and genuinely rewarding experiences that clearly had thought, time, and effort put into them. And of course, what resulted from this was a veritable market explosion. For years, the overwhelming bulk of the early to late 2010s, Endless Runners dominated the app stores, no matter the platform. If you grew up during this time period, there's almost certainly one or two Endless Runners that played a large role in your formative years. But as you most likely know, this is far from the end of the tale. In March of 2014, a 19-year-old Italian web dev named Gabriele Cerulli designed a simple browser puzzle game called 2048 over the course of a weekend. inspired by several very similar titles from the previous month, which had in turn been inspired by a previous mobile hit called Threes. The game involved the simple sliding of a grid of numbered tiles with the goal of combining them and reaching the largest tile possible. 2048 was really nothing more than a quick prototype Cerulli had created to test game design and animation techniques, but fate had slightly different plans. 2048 rapidly became an overnight hit, receiving millions of site visits and spreading across virtually every single social media network at the time. Many among you may remember the recent success of Wordle, a 2021 web-based word puzzle game that was eventually sold to the New York Times for a massive sum. 2048 was essentially the Wordle of 2014. The game was just about everywhere you looked, its simple controls and objectives making it almost universal in its ability to entertain players. But amidst all this success, Gabriel Cerulli wasn't feeling too good. By his own admission, 2048 wasn't exactly an original idea. It was a hastily built clone of a ripoff of Threes, a genuinely interesting game with years of development put into it, that in my opinion is legitimately one of the most entertaining puzzle games I've ever played. Cerulli was strongly against exploiting the success of 2048 to make money for himself, and was doubtful about making a mobile game even if the game were to be free. Unbeknownst to Cerulli, however, there was another group watching these events unfold, and they weren't nearly as apprehensive. French video game publisher Ketchup had been formed that same month by brothers Antoine and Michel Morcos. Almost immediately after its founding, Ketchup got to work, and its first major success was, as you might have guessed, a mobile clone of 2048, published at the peak of the original game's popularity. Cerulli had made his game open source and had never technically registered any kind of copyright for it, so Ketchup's re-release of the title for mobile wasn't exactly illegal, but it was nonetheless considered more than a little sleazy at the time. What it did do, however, was give people exactly what they wanted, and while Cerulli was ruminating over whether or not a mobile port would be acceptable, Ketchup's clone had already shot to the top of the App Store, complete with heavy ads and in-app purchases. By the time Cerulli decided to release an official unmonetized port of 2048, the unauthorized Ketchup replica had already been dominating sales and would continue to be the #1 2048 app for a long time. 2048's popularity by this point had begun to die down, but like a leviathan rising from the depths below, Ketchup had arisen, and it was not soon to sink back down again. Around this time, in the early to mid-2010s, a large number of developers would begin springing to life all across the globe with aspirations very similar to those of Ketchup. Names like Quali, Voodoo, and Kayak hit the scene circa 2014 and would begin to rapidly pump out new releases, in some cases on a weekly basis. Many of these companies began with a rogues gallery of clones, unauthorized ports, and mimics of all shapes and sizes, but they gradually transitioned to publishing original titles by the time the middle of the decade rolled around. If you still don't know what I'm talking about, or this doesn't sound familiar, let's go through a couple, shall we? Helix Jump, Mr. Gun, Space Frontier, Aerofest, Gun Sprint, Crowd Defense, Flipping Hero, Slice It All, Tall Man Fucking Run. If you've heard of any of these, congratulations, you've been touched by a digital sensation that is sweeping the nation, or at least the mobile app store. This new wave of games run the gamut of gameplay styles and objectives, but piece by piece have managed to gain a stranglehold on mobile gaming in the past few years. And all in all, on the surface, this new wave of mobile experiences would honestly seem to just be the next incarnation of the endless runner and arcade-style tradition. They follow the formula almost to a T. Gameplay is simplistic and straightforward, easy to pick up, and consisting of simple one-touch or tap-and-hold controls. They often feature procedural challenges, randomly generated buffs and obstacles that the player must continue to avoid. And whether split into levels or made a continuous runnable plane, gameplay never truly ends, instead simply escalating until it becomes too difficult for the player. But take a look under the hood, and the differences become starkly apparent. The modern endless runner or arcade-style hit seen in its element on the front page of the App Store has, on account of these differences, earned itself a genre of its own. Enter the hyper-casual game. If an endless runner can be seen as a streamlining or simplification of the arcade concept, a hyper-casual game strips things even further down, if such a thing is even possible. Controls are even simpler, almost exclusively consisting of a single unchanging action controlled by simple taps or, on rare recursions, left-right movement. Gameplay is similarly simple, maintaining the defensive endless movement style, but foregoing all but the most basic of mechanics. As such, these games feature no tutorial. They bear no instructions. Even their art has been stripped back to essentials, basic lines and colors with little detail to distract the player. Hyper-casual titles, more so than endless runners of the past, are an abstraction of a video game, a series of moving colors and shapes only loosely directed by the basic actions of the player. And this makes them, as the name implies, hyper-casual. Anyone can pick up one of these games and play them for an arbitrary amount of time with literally no prior experience or instruction. One of Ketchup's founders was quoted in 2014 remarking that the company is not doing games for gamers. They employed the same strategy that Atari had in the past with arcade games, creating experiences that didn't rely on game sense or any previous knowledge. The result of this, of course, is nearly universal appeal. So it would seem to be fairly open and shut. Hyper-casual games have emerged as the next evolution of the endless runner and have supplanted it as the dominant force in mobile app stores. But before we go, why don't we take a slightly deeper look? 'Cause, well, it's sort of a mess down there. Hyper-casual titles, upon close inspection, are really just the shells of true endless runners. Shadows, ghosts, echoes of the genuinely interesting endless titles of the past. They have all the form, but absolutely none of the function, and it's for this reason that they've brought on what many see as a negative shift in the direction of today's mobile app scene. So let's take a look at that. To make it easy, we can really just compare it to the things that made endless runners of the past so effective, beginning, of course, with replayability. Now, remember how I described the degree to which classic endless runners had hidden depths that weren't apparent when you first booted the game up, and that this is one of the reasons they remain so damn interesting even after you played them for hours? Well, imagine, if you can, the complete opposite. With the newest wave of hyper-casual experiences, what you see is quite literally what you get. In Helix Jump, you never progress beyond rotating the pillar to make the ball fall down. You're introduced to virtually everything you'll ever experience within usually the first 5 minutes of gameplay, and it doesn't get any deeper than that. Almost nothing is revealed as you continue to improve and level up. It's just there to be taken at face value. But this is just the start. Along with being shallow, these game experiences are no longer unique either. Gone are clever uses of the phone's simple control schemes or complex mechanics dictated by seemingly uncomplicated controls. And in their place are games whose controls and mechanics are really as simple as they seem. If it looks like all you have to do in Aerofest is move left and right and choose the path with the better number, then that's it. Very few of these titles feature gameplay that's anything beyond make a simple movement and hit the finish line. Some very well might have unique systems of their own, but it gets even harder to tell when you realize that, well, they all copy each other. Sometimes it's even hard to tell which one is the original and which is the copy. It's like some fucked up digital version of the chicken or the egg. This uniformity even goes for the art styles. Very rarely do they deviate from simple, brightly colored, basic shapes, and there's never really any detail to make even that interesting. But we can go even further beyond replayability and uniqueness. Now, I will admit that as far as gameplay goes, these games are honestly great at first. In fact, that's sort of the point. They draw you in with extremely engaging gameplay that seems to promise an addicting game experience to come. They're meant to be satisfying, usually making use of physics simulations and heavy particle effects, intended to be visually pleasing on a surface level. They often feature heavy emphasis on feedback features, phone vibrations, flashy visuals, percussive sound effects, and so on, all designed to pull you in immediately. Though, of course, like everything I've described before, it's all just hollow promises. The initially enthralling gameplay and sensory feedback is like the fleeting high you get from caffeine. Once it fades away after a few hours, it's hard to get more out of it. But as before, the final nail in the coffin is borne by that ever-important sense of progression. The crux that kept everyone from Galaga players in the 1980s to Jetpack Joyride players in 2013 coming back to the game to try another run. And within the DNA of the modern hyper-casual design, we find this to be almost non-existent. Easy to learn and easy to master, you can all but ace most games of these types within a handful of hours. That gradually ramping difficulty scale that makes it impactful to make it just a few steps further is no more, and instead we get a difficulty curve that flattens out almost immediately in most cases. What upgrades there are will be largely cosmetic or make the game easy to the point of boredom, and most of them will just be skins anyway. So with no real progression to be made through skill or upgrades, these games will instead attempt to create it synthetically. Upgrades are locked behind arbitrarily large paywalls, meant to make each upgrade seem like a true achievement. Moreover, you'll see heavy use of random item pulls and randomized upgrades to artificially slow down your progress. And what progress is there? Levels and distance will go on and on and on. Numbers of cache, numbers of enemies, level numbers always getting bigger, but the core experiences remain stagnant. You're meant to feel good about reaching level 400, but when level 400 features difficulty almost identical to that of level 4, it just feels more like a slow, dreary march than a triumphant marathon victory. And of course, just to spice things up, there's bound to be an ad or two between every run you complete, just to make things a little more special. Now, there is, of course, absolutely nothing wrong with enjoying a game like this. I'm completely guilty of playing games like this all the time. They're literally designed to draw you in, and there's no shame in having a little fun playing one. But it can't be denied that they aren't exactly a worthy successor to the endless runners of the past. Classic runners embodied the idea of less is more. They spun engaging and enjoyable experiences that would develop over time and belie the hidden complexity just beneath their otherwise simple outward appearances. They embraced the mobile limitations and learned to create wonderful worlds regardless. But the games that have come seemingly to replace them double down on the limitations. They live within them, creating experiences that are shallow, uncomplex, and in the long run, just not that fun. These are nothing games. They're not bad, they're just empty, hollow. You never really progress or improve. It's just like playing a demo that never ends. In years gone by, a potentially infinite game seemed like a vast road extending before you, fraught with danger, adventure, and mystery. It was fun not because we thought it would ever end, but because we knew that it would. It was just so damn fun to see how long we could make it last. But now, the endless expanse presented to us seems more like an eternity of limbo. So, knowing all of this, if everything I've just said is true, then one question remains. How the hell are they so damn popular? To parse out this final question, let's take a few steps back, say 2016, 2017. At this point, hyper-casual games, inspired largely by classic endless runners and even more so by the simplified nature of hits like Flappy Bird and Crossy Road, had only just begun to take off. And if we take a snapshot of them at this time, they're not quite as far removed. In many cases, they're more like fusion titles, halfway between high-speed arcade-style runners and contemporary puzzle or strategy games like 2048. Ketchup's early 2016 hit Stack illustrates this, and many more were, at that point, just somewhat simplistic runners like any other. Again, from Ketchup, 2017's Rider was a big hit with me and my friends around this time. Although a little buggy, it seemed to have some genuine effort put in, and its simple car-flipping gameplay took genuine skill to master. At this point in their evolution, many of these games were only slightly exaggerated versions of existing game concepts. But it was this very exaggeration and bastardization that took things to where they are now. Month by month, year by year, these games changed. Graphics became cleaner, controls became simpler, mechanics became shallower by the minute. Gameplay becomes ever more repetitive competitive and ever less diverse, and within just a few years we had arrived at the state of things today. When compared side by side, the 5 years between rider and crowd defense seem long indeed. But that question rears its head again. Why? Why did a cohort of otherwise ordinary game developers making largely ordinary games devolve into factories for pumping out low-quality and soulless titles on the daily? Well, what if we're looking at this wrong? I've been conducting this whole show from history to gameplay analysis from the perspective of a person who picks up one of these games and wants to play. This person would probably never make a game like Tall Man Run, but they don't have to, because there's companies ready to do it for them. Look up almost anything pertaining to hyper-casual games, and you'll find language that's strangely corporate and cynical for discussions of these silly little mobile runners, market shares, trend insights, profitability, and downloads in Q1. Hyper-casual games aren't games, they're a business model. The companies responsible for them execute a carpet bombing strategy, saturating the market with game after game, never really investing any effort into any individual one, but counting on sheer numbers to do the job. These companies understand the games don't have a huge amount of staying power. They understand that they often become dull within a week. But it doesn't matter, because for every game you grow tired of after a few days, there are 10 more that have been released in the time since. And this, in and of itself, is the business model. Create a game, or more commonly, license it from an independent developer, release it, then begin work on the next game immediately afterwards. And because these games all essentially advertise and promote each other, they act sort of like a connected ecosystem of sorts, designed to lead the player from game to game. You can see this clearly by looking at the analytics of, say, Supersonic Studios. Very few of their games make more than $5,000 a month. But because they've published 82 of them in the past 2 years, the money adds up very, very quickly. And since each game is free while being loaded to the brim with ads, they can get their money while the getting is good and get out in time for a player to move on to the next of their games. And what results from this maelstrom of activity is a massive, seemingly unending stream of games that are cheap, shallow, and uninteresting, but very, very profitable. Now, I'll stop myself right there. Let's be done with all the doom and gloom. Because, as always, it's not really as bad as it seems. While it is true that mobile app stores are constantly being inundated with hollow cash grabs, you probably notice that they don't last very long. It's rare for one to stay popular for more than a couple months at a time. Compare this to companies like Halfbrick, who created games over a decade ago that continue to occasionally rise to the top of the App Store leaderboards. And even today, many genuinely good endless runners continue to be made, and with luck they won't be overshadowed by the endless slew of garbage titles being churned out on a daily basis. Or maybe not. In the end, it's honestly all subjective. There's no real definition of what makes a game good. That has been, and always will be, something we just have to find out for ourselves. But it's undeniable that the chain of events that have led us to the current state of things, the birth of video games, the rise and fall of the arcade, the rebirth of the endless runner, and the awakening of its sinister counterpart, is a truly insane look into how we, as human beings, endeavor to entertain ourselves. We can only hope as we move forward into an uncertain future that the honesty and spirit responsible for so many genre-defining titles will continue to burn brightly in the years to come. Thanks for watching.